Welcome to the Marine Biologist podcast. Join us to discover the latest topics by leading marine researchers and conservationists. The podcast accompanies The Marine Biologist, the magazine for members of the Marine Biological Association, and is presented by the editor, Guy Baker.
We're delighted to welcome Zoe Roseby to the Marine Biologist podcast. Zoe, welcome along, and can you introduce yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Zoe Roseby. I am a sedimentologist and I work at the University of Exeter as a postdoctoral researcher. I'm currently working with the Convex Seascape Survey, which is a 5-year project which is run by the University of Exeter and the Blue Marine Foundation and funded by the Convex Insurance Group to investigate carbon in continental shelf sediments.
The first question I had was, why does the study focus on Norway lobster and why in this particular location?
So this study is really focused on muddy sediments. So we are interested so we know that muddy sediments generally store more organic carbon than other substrate types like sands and gravels. But we're interested in kind of investigating how muds vary within themselves. So which muds contain more organic carbon, more vulnerable organic carbon, or sediments or carbon that accumulate very slowly. We're looking at kind of how that differs between mud basins to get an idea of overall vulnerability of organic carbon. So the case study that we investigated was the splading ground in the northern North Sea. So this happens to be an area of very, very low sediment accumulation, so it's very, very low modern input. But it also happens to be an area of high historic trawling intensity. So these muddy sediments host species like Norway lobster and northern shrimp. So that area has been trawled over several decades. So this kind of set up a case study for us to think about the vulnerability of muds in a basin where there is very low input of sediments and organic carbon, and then also whether we can see any evidence of modification of those sediments from the ongoing trawling. So the species themselves isn't the subject. We're more looking at like the overlap between natural drivers of organic carbon and sediment accumulation in these muddy sediments and the interaction between those sediments and kind of human disturbance, including collection or trawling for these Norway lobster nephrops.
I saw there's an MPA, Marine Protected Area, in the Flading Ground, and it's designated to protect sea pens and burrowing animals. Was any of the work, did you use the MPA to compare sort of untrawled and trawled areas of the seabed?
Yeah, it's actually really useful that there's an MPA that's been proposed and now installed in that region, because there is a lot of data from the area. So, for example, from this study, I really pulled on some information on historic evidence for trawling. So there's evidence of trawl scars on the seabed because they took a lot of sediment or seabed images when they were thinking about designating this MPA and collecting evidence of like the species that live there and their abundance. So we did consider the MPA, but what's interesting about the MPA is that it was not kind of carbon, and the sediments don't really come into the establishment of the MPA, but it still provides really valuable information for us to understand the habitat.
And considering the kind of the balance between what nature does to seabeds and what people do to seabeds. So I read that burrowing animals churn the mud and release nutrients and mix oxygen into the mud. How does this natural bioturbation compare with trawling in terms of releasing carbon?
The way the sediments will be kind of turned over will be completely different in each process. So burrowing animals they could be moving nutrients up or down into the sediments, whereas trawling is kind of turning over the sediments and lofting more sediments. So I think that, although I don't know the values, if I think about kind of the sedimentary processes, they're kind of doing very different things, because when you trawl sediments, you're kind of lofting them, creating this plume. What we're interested in, or part of what we're interested in, and the kind of evidence that we see is the trawling that creates this plume of sediments can actually lead to some of the muds being kind of winnowed away. And it's the muds that contain the carbon. So there's been evidence from a couple of different kind of continental shelf sites that show that areas where there's high amounts of trawling, the sediments can be coarser because the muds have actually been lost. So the mechanics of those processes are very different in terms of the sediment disturbance and the carbon disturbance. So they would be such a challenging thing to compare. And I think that even though there is obviously going to be biology turning over sediments, I think that their overall impact is still not fully understood. And it's something that researchers on the Convex project are investigating, is that, are they transporting, they could be potentially transporting carbon down to kind of beyond the mixed layers, so actually helping with storage. But so they're very different mechanisms. But I think that the turning over sediments by trawling and the plumes of sediments that are produced is something that I don't imagine can be created naturally.
The flading ground, you said, it's somewhere where the accumulation of carbon is historic, talking kind of ice age timescales. So is there an example of a basin where mud's sort of recent and accumulating rapidly? And how does that happen, that one basin's defunct as a sort of place where carbon accumulates and other places are accumulating a lot?
Yeah, exactly. This is exactly what we're interested in. So yeah, I think in terms of assessing carbon vulnerability in muds, the kind of sources and the history of that accumulation is really important, and that varies per site. So the flading ground is an example of an almost relict mud basin. So most of the muds that are that form that mud basin were transported and deposited there after the last glacial maximum, which was around 21,000 years ago. So 20,000 years ago, the North Sea had ice sheets coming from Scandinavia and Scotland that were kind of converging in the North Sea. And then as those kind of melted back towards land, huge amounts of mud and fine sediments melted out of the ice or were kind of brought in by rivers, because sea level would also have been lower, and would have allowed lots of fine sediment delivery that would have allowed these mud basins to develop. As soon as that source has disappeared, so in that case, it's the ice, that delivery slows down. So in the flading ground now, we have this kind of deglaciated setting. We have the source is gone, and with the input of mud and organic matter from that source is very low. There are other mud basins, including in the Irish Sea, in the Celtic Sea, the Western Irish Sea mud belt, the Celtic Deep. Those have muds and carbons that have been accumulating closer to present day, and that's because their sources would still be active. So they have kind of ongoing riverine input or ongoing productivity that provides biological organic matter. So this means that sort of when we think about disturbance, so say trawl gear can penetrate 10 centimeters down into the seabed. In the flading ground, the top 10 centimeters of sediments might have been deposited as much as over 2,000 years, whereas in another basin that could be tens to hundreds of years. So we're kind of interested in that concept and what that means for vulnerability, because if you think of that carbon that's been sourced from ice sheets being disturbed, obviously in our lifetimes, that can't be easily replaced. So that's kind of one thing that we were considering, is replenishment of organic matter and carbon to a mud basin. But then the other side of that is, well, how vulnerable is that carbon anyway? So even though the flading ground one trawl event might loft sediments that were deposited over 2,000 years and couldn't be easily replaced in our lifetime, that doesn't necessarily make that place the most vulnerable setting to disturbance, because that carbon, there's different types of carbon that can be, we call it remineralized or lost. And the amount of that vulnerable carbon also varies per basin. So that's why we have to tie in this kind of idea of vulnerability of the specific carbon and the timescales over which it can be replenished to give an idea of overall vulnerability.
And are you working on a tool that maps vulnerability?
It's something that we're definitely working towards getting an idea of comparing different like mud basins. So we work on this kind of case study approach. So this flading ground is one case study. We're also going to be comparing results. We've got other work coming up that looks at other mud basins. There are also other research groups investigating other mud basins in detail. So I think that as part of the Convex project and also as part of this kind of blue carbon community more generally, there is just wider exploration into the kind of nuances that it's not just like muds, not muds in terms of like vulnerable, not vulnerable, but we're all sort of putting together these case studies to consider that vulnerability varies a lot per site and that's important in terms of creating like management decisions if we were going to start thinking about protecting sedimentary carbon stocks.
How do you go about determining whether it's an old carbon store or a new carbon store? What do you do to the mud samples to identify them in that sense?
Yeah, so that comes from age depth modeling of sediments. So we basically take sediment cores from these mud basins. So we end up with these kind of long tubes of sediments where kind of the bottom of the sediment core is the older sediments, and then it goes all the way up to the sea floor. When we open those cores, we can take samples of either shells or other calcareous animals, including like foraminifera, to get radiocarbon dates. So those dates then provide us with an age and a depth. For example, 50 centimeters deep, 1,000 years ago, 1 meter deep, 2,000 years ago. We can then just use the depth difference and the age difference to calculate the sedimentation rate for that site. So we can then think about how sedimentation rates have changed over time. So in the flading ground, we went from very, very high sediment and carbon accumulation rates to very low after this source disappeared. So that's an interesting angle. You can look at the change over time, or we can compare different mud basins. So we can say, well, in this mud basin, the top 50 centimeters was accumulated over a much larger amount of time than over here. So this area has got rapidly accumulating sedimentary carbon, and this place has very low accumulating sedimentary carbon. So it's producing these age depth models and using those to calculate sediment and carbon accumulation rates.
Is protecting seabed analogous to protecting soils on land?
I think that that's an analog that I do use when I talk to people. So I don't know, like, I don't imagine it's like a perfect match, but I think that it is a helpful analog in terms of thinking about, on land, we know that some environments and habitats are more important for carbon storage than others. And that's really well understood. And I think that on the sea floor, because it's obviously not something that we observe all the time, is that we have a similar range of habitats that serve different roles like we have in the terrestrial environment. So although I'm not sure that scientifically they are exactly the same, I think from a communication angle, they're actually really helpful to think about variability in the terrestrial environment, something that people can observe, and using that to translate to the sea floor, saying that, not all areas of the sea floor are equally important in terms of carbon storage, and that human activities can disturb that carbon, which is also a narrative of the terrestrial environment as well.
Yeah, one, maybe you don't want to stretch too far, but helpful to give that understanding.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how biology tends to push carbon down over long time periods through gravity, or pump it down through the activities of fish and microbes and so on. And all this stuff's sort of falling and being pushed downwards into seabeds and soils, and people tend to kind of lift carbon up very rapidly, don't we? Either pumping it out, pumping hydrocarbons, or disturbing soils and seabeds. We're sort of,
yeah, I know, it's so true. Like sediments and carbon accumulate so incredibly slowly. Yeah, like with this example in the flading ground, like you don't have to dig very deep to go back a long time.
So as we said, there's a marine protected area in the flading ground designated to protect certain species. And that's what MPAs have historically been developed to do, to protect species and habitats. Do you have any views on how difficult it might be to expand this network of MPAs to protect sensitive muddy seabeds?
In terms of providing the data, that's not massively challenging. I mean, especially around the UK, our carbon is very well mapped. And we also have quite a good idea of how the vulnerability of that carbon varies as well. So we have a lot of information there already. My understanding is that historically, large patches of muds have not been high priorities for protection because they're not the most charismatic settings. I think the Flading Ground MPA is now quite a unique example of a continent, at least in the UK, like a continental shelf mud protected area. It's something that I think the research community of blue carbon would like to be considered. And I think the data sets are almost there for that definitely to be part of the consideration, for sure.
So it's that weighing up, how does protection of mud for future climate benefits weigh up against the potential loss of income now for fishers who could potentially be displaced from newly protected areas?
That's like exactly what we're trying to understand. And I think that's why having these case studies is so useful, because we can't say, and we don't want to say, that trawling muds is bad, like as a blanket statement, because we are finding that they are very, very variable in terms of how vulnerable that carbon is. So I think that having this, and I mean, I think would be a way off those decisions anyway, saying like you can't disturb these sediments because of this carbon. I think that we're exactly at the right point of building up an evidence base so that if and when those decisions were to be made, we were bringing in vulnerability into that discussion. So like the Flading Ground, for example, has very, very low modern organic carbon and sediment input. That might make it less vulnerable to disturbance actually than other mud basins. So you could then start to use carbon vulnerability and that spatial variability to guide some sort of spatial management.
Zoe, it's been fantastic talking to you. I never knew there was so much to mud and found out some really interesting things. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the magazine and hear you on the podcast again.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Enjoyed this podcast? Why not become a member of the Marine Biological Association and become part of a global community advocating for the ocean? You'll receive 4 beautiful copies of our magazine annually, The Marine Biologist, as well as receive a host of other benefits. Simply join us at www.mba.ac.uk.